The British Empire controlled a quarter of the planet. They had the guns, the ships, and the money. But one man in a loincloth figured out how to make them go broke. This is the story of how Mahatma Gandhi didn't just fight the British with protests and speeches. He fought them where it actually hurt. Their bank accounts. He looked at the biggest empire in human history and realized something nobody else saw. They weren't in India to civilize anyone. They were there to make money. And if he could turn their cash machine into a money pit, they'd pack up and leave on their own. This is the story of one of the greatest economic takedowns in modern history. Let's go back to before Gandhi, to understand what he was up against. In the 1700s, India wasn't poor. That's the part they don't teach you in school. India controlled 25% of the world's economy. 1/4 of all the money on planet Earth flowed through Indian hands. And the crown jewel of that economy was cloth. Indian weavers were legends. They made cotton fabric so fine that Europeans called it woven air. They created muslin so delicate that an entire dress could pass through a wedding ring. The royal courts in Paris and London were obsessed with Indian textiles. It was the best fabric money could buy, and everybody knew it. When British traders first showed up in India, they came with their hats in their hands. They were there to buy, not to boss anyone around. They stood there amazed at the Indian looms and the skills that had been perfected over thousands of years. But then something changed. The East India Company stopped being a trading company and became an army. They conquered provinces. They collected taxes. They made the rules. And once they had that power, they realized something. Why compete with Indian weavers when you could just destroy them? Back in England, the Industrial Revolution was starting. Inventors were building machines that could spin cotton faster than human hands. But here's the problem. These machines made rough, scratchy cloth that couldn't compete with the smooth, high-quality stuff from India. In a fair fight, the British mills would have gone bankrupt. So the British decided to cheat. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in economic history. The British slapped massive taxes on Indian cloth entering England. At the same time, they forced India to accept British cloth with zero taxes. But they didn't stop there. British agents would go to Indian weavers and force them to sign contracts selling their goods at a loss. If a weaver said no, they'd beat him, throw him in jail. Historical accounts describe horrific punishments inflicted on weavers, including mutilation, though historians debate how widespread these acts were. Regardless, the industry was destroyed, and generations lost their livelihoods. Whether every single story is exactly true or not, the result was real. The knowledge died. The looms got smashed. Cities like Dhaka and Murshidabad, which had been huge centers of commerce for centuries, turned into ghost towns. A British governor named William Bentinck wrote in 1834 that the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. Think about that. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He was admitting what they'd done. Millions of artisans who had clothed the world were forced to become landless peasants. They starved because their livelihood had been stolen to make room for Manchester's factories. By the mid-1800s, the transformation was complete. India went from being a manufacturer to being a farm. Indian farmers were forced to grow cotton under the burning sun, sell it for pennies, and watch it turned into cloth in Manchester before returning home for sale. And here's the cruelest part. Indians were forced to buy that British cloth because their own industry was dead. They had no choice. They were wearing the cotton they grew, but paying the British for it. This was the drain. A massive funnel sucking wealth out of India and pouring it into London banks. It funded the Victorian mansions. It funded the railways. It funded Britain's expansion into Africa and Asia. The British elite thought it would last forever. They called it free trade. But it was really a monopoly enforced by warships. When Mohandas Gandhi came back to India in 1915 after spending years in South Africa, he looked at his country with fresh eyes. He saw the poverty. He saw the hunger. But unlike other nationalist leaders, Gandhi didn't just see political oppression. He saw the math. He realized the British Raj wasn't a government. It was a business. The British were in India because it was profitable. As long as India made them money, they'd never leave. You could kill soldiers and they'd send more. You could riot and they'd arrest you. But if you took away the profit, if you made their balance sheet bleed red, they'd leave on their own. Gandhi understood that textiles were the pillar of British power. It was their biggest export. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers in Manchester. It had built the modern British state. But this strength was also their greatest weakness. The entire industry relied on Indian customers. If Indians simply refused to buy the cloth, the factories would stop. The money would stop. The empire would become a burden instead of a gold mine. This was a radical idea. Most revolutionaries think about seizing power. Gandhi thought about cutting off the supply chain. Gandhi started preaching something that confused a lot of people at first. He didn't talk about guns or bombs. He talked about spinning wheels. He launched the Khadi movement. Khadi is hand-spun, hand-woven cloth. It's rough. It's simple. It's not as smooth or comfortable as the factory-made stuff from England. But Gandhi told Indians that Khadi was sacred. He said every yard of British cloth they bought was a chain tying them to slavery. Every time they wore a Manchester shirt, they were stealing food from a starving Indian weaver. He turned getting dressed into an act of war. Gandhi was a genius at branding. He knew he had to lead by example. He took off his Western suits, the clothes of a lawyer and a gentleman, and put on a simple loincloth made of Khadi. He sat down in public with a charka, a traditional spinning wheel, and started spinning thread. He spun for hours every day. He spun while talking to diplomats. He spun during speeches. He made the spinning wheel the symbol of revolution. He told the Indian elite, the lawyers and doctors and rich merchants, that they had to burn their foreign clothes. He organized massive bonfires in cities like Bombay and Kolkata. Picture this. Thousands of people gathering in public squares, carrying their finest suits, their silk shirts, their expensive dresses made in Manchester mills. They threw them onto a pile, and as flames rose up, destroying millions of rupees worth of property, the crowd cheered. It was a ritual. They were burning their dependence. They were burning the mental hold the British had over them. The British laughed at first. Winston Churchill called Gandhi a half-naked Farker. British officials in Delhi sipped their gin and tonics and joked about the little man with his spinning wheel. They said you can't stop the modern world with a medieval tool. They said you can't fight the Industrial Revolution with a piece of wood. They didn't understand what Gandhi was doing. He wasn't trying to compete with Manchester on efficiency. He was trying to destroy their market. He was building a wall of moral refusal. He made it shameful to wear foreign cloth. If you walked down the street in a British suit, people stared at you with disgust. You were a traitor. You were a collaborator. The social pressure was massive. And then the numbers started changing. Orders from India began drying up. Ships arriving in Bombay weren't unloading as fast. Warehouses in Manchester started filling up with unsold stock. The mill owners got nervous. They'd always assumed the Indian market was endless. They'd expanded their factories and hired thousands of workers based on one assumption: that 300 million Indians would always need British clothes. But now Indians were making their own. It was rough cloth. It was itchy. But they wore it with pride. The Khadi movement spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about clothes anymore. It was about dignity. Gandhi had given the poorest peasant a weapon. You didn't need a gun to fight the British. You just needed to spin. You just needed to say no. The economic impact was slow at first, but it picked up speed. By the early 1920s, British textile exports to India began collapsing. The Great Depression hit in 1929, which made things worse, but the boycott was the hammer blow. The Indian National Congress officially adopted the boycott of foreign goods as their main strategy. They picketed shops selling British cloth. Women played a huge role. They'd stand outside textile stores and beg customers not to buy. They'd lie down in doorways so you'd have to step over them to buy a British shirt. It worked. Shopkeepers stopped stocking British goods because nobody was buying. Import figures collapsed. In some years, imports of British cloth fell by more than 50%. This was a disaster for Manchester. In the industrial towns of northern England, the lights started going out. Mills that had run 24 hours a day suddenly cut shifts. Then they went to 3 days a week. Then they closed completely. The chimneys stopped smoking. Silence fell over towns like Blackburn, Darwen, and Burnley. Tens of thousands of British workers lost their jobs. These were tough people. They'd worked in mills their whole lives. Their parents and grandparents had worked there too. They didn't understand Indian politics. They only knew the orders had stopped. They only knew there was no money for food. Poverty in Manchester in the 1930s was brutal. Families lived on scraps. Men stood on street corners begging for work. The British press blamed Gandhi. They called him the villain who was starving British workers. They tried to turn the English working class against Indian independence. But Gandhi was playing a long game. He knew that by hurting the British working class, he was creating a political crisis in London. Politicians could ignore a riot in Delhi, but they couldn't ignore mass unemployment in Manchester. Voters in England were angry. Pressure on the government to solve the India problem was building. Gandhi was forcing the British to do a cost-benefit analysis. Was holding on to India worth destroying their own domestic industry? Was the jewel in the crown worth the price if it was bankrupting the homeland? This brings us to one of the most surreal moments in 20th century history. In 1931, Gandhi was invited to London for a conference to discuss India's future. He was the enemy. He was the man destroying the British economy. But he did something no normal politician would do. He asked to visit Manchester. He wanted to go to the heart of the devastation he'd caused. He wanted to look unemployed workers in the eye. The British government was terrified. They thought he'd be attacked. They thought angry mobs of jobless mill workers would tear him apart. Why would they welcome the man who'd taken their jobs? But Gandhi insisted. He traveled north to the grim industrial towns. He stayed in simple houses. He walked through streets wrapped in his white shawl against the cold English rain. And then something amazing happened. The workers didn't attack him. They came out in thousands to see him. They cheered him. These men and women who'd lost everything, who were hungry and desperate, looked at this small, frail man and saw something the politicians didn't see. They saw a man of truth. They saw a man fighting for his people just like they were fighting for theirs. There's a famous photo of Gandhi surrounded by female mill workers in Darwen. They're all smiling. One woman is holding his arm. It's a picture of incredible humanity. Gandhi spoke to them. He explained his position. He said, "I'm not against you. I'm against the system that exploits both of us." He told them about poverty in India. He told them about the skeletons he'd seen in villages. He said, "I'm pained by your poverty, but in India, we have no food at all." He explained that the average Indian earned in a year what the average British worker earned in a week, even on unemployment benefits. He asked them to understand that he couldn't let his people starve just to keep Manchester mills running. The workers listened. One union leader told him, "Mr. Gandhi, I understand we are suffering, but you are suffering more." It was a moment that shattered British propaganda. The government wanted workers to hate Gandhi, but they respected him instead. This visit was a masterstroke. It humanized the Indian struggle for the British public. It showed Gandhi wasn't a monster, but a man of huge moral courage. But it didn't stop the boycott. Gandhi left Manchester with their blessings, but he didn't promise to buy their cloth. He went back to India and tightened the screws. The mills stayed closed. Grass grew in cracks on factory floors. The British Empire kept bleeding money. The textile trade never recovered. The fires from the cloth bonfires were still burning when Gandhi decided to attack another front. He'd already hit textiles, the biggest money maker for the empire. Now he turned to something even more basic. Something every human needed to survive. Salt. To most people, salt seems like a small thing. It's cheap. It's everywhere. But Gandhi looked at salt and saw the perfect symbol of colonial tyranny. The British Raj had a monopoly on salt production and sales in India. It was illegal for an Indian to walk to the ocean and scoop up natural salt. They had to buy it from the government. And the government taxed it ruthlessly. In some regions, the tax exceeded 2,000% of production cost. It was literally a tax on sweating. In a hot climate like India, where hard labor in fields drains your body of salt, this tax hit the poorest people hardest. A starving peasant who could barely afford rice had to pay the British Empire for salt to cook it with. Gandhi saw the financial genius of this tax for the British and the moral outrage for Indians. The salt tax brought in millions of rupees for the Raj. It funded the army occupying the country. It funded the lavish lifestyle of the viceroy. Gandhi realized that if he could break the salt monopoly, he'd cut off another revenue stream. He'd also show the world the absurdity of British rule. He'd prove the British were claiming ownership over the ocean itself. When he announced his plan to march to the sea and make illegal salt, Congress leaders were skeptical. They wanted to demand big things like independence and constitutional reform. They thought salt was trivial. But Gandhi understood mass psychology and economics. He knew every Indian understood salt. He knew if he could get millions of people to break this one small law, British administration would become impossible. You can arrest 1,000 people. You can't arrest 100 million. On March 12, 1930, the march began. Gandhi was 61 years old. He walked fast. He led a small group of 78 volunteers from his ashram. They walked for 24 days, covering 240 miles. As they walked, the legend grew. Villagers poured out to see the holy man fighting the British with a pinch of salt. Crowds swelled to thousands, then tens of thousands. International press arrived. Journalists from America and Europe walked alongside him, sending dispatches to their newspapers. The world was watching. The British government was paralyzed. If they arrested him too early, he'd become a martyr. If they let him reach the sea, they'd look weak. They did nothing. They hoped he'd die of exhaustion. They hoped the movement would fizzle out. They underestimated the old man's stamina and the people's anger. On the morning of April 6, Gandhi reached the coast at Dandi. He walked into the waves. He bent down and picked up a lump of salty mud. With that simple gesture, he broke the law. He held it up for the crowd to see. It was a signal. Across the entire coastline of India, from Karachi to Madras, millions rushed to the water. Fishermen, peasants, women, children all began boiling seawater in pots. They scraped salt from rocks. They set up illegal salt pans. They sold contraband salt in markets openly. Police tried to stop them. They beat protesters with steel-tipped batons. They arrested 60,000 people. But jails filled up. Police got exhausted. And the salt kept coming. The British monopoly was broken. Revenue from the salt tax collapsed. But more importantly, fear of the British was broken. You can't govern people who refuse to obey your most basic laws. The Salt March and the Cloth Boycott were two arms of a pincer movement crushing the profitability of the Raj. By the late 1930s, the empire's balance sheet was a disaster. The cost of maintaining control in India rose every year. Police forces had to expand to deal with civil disobedience. The army had to stay on high alert. Prisons were overflowing, which cost money to run. At the same time, revenue was falling. Textile duties were down. The salt tax was unenforceable. Liquor taxes were being targeted by temperance movements led by Gandhi's followers. The British were spending more to govern India than they were extracting from it. The Great Depression had already weakened the British economy. Now their biggest asset was becoming a liability. The board of directors of the British Empire, which is basically what Parliament was, had to look at the numbers. The return on investment for holding India was turning negative. Then came World War II. This was the final nail in the coffin. Britain was fighting for survival against Nazi Germany. They needed every penny. They needed every soldier. They couldn't afford to garrison a hostile subcontinent in open revolt. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942. He told the British to leave immediately. He told Indians to stop cooperating entirely. The British responded with brutal force. They arrested the entire Congress leadership. They put Gandhi in prison. They deployed battalions to crush protests. But the cost was insane. Britain ended the war bankrupt. They owed billions to America. They owed billions to India itself in the form of sterling balance debt. They didn't have the cash or energy to hold on to a colony determined to be free. The transfer of power in 1947 was a political event, but it was driven by economic reality. The British left because the business model failed. Gandhi destroyed it. He proved that unarmed people could defeat a military superpower if they were willing to suffer and if they attacked the economic foundation of their occupier. But the story doesn't end with the British leaving. The legacy of the Cloth War shaped India's future and Manchester's memory. In India, the spinning wheel became the national symbol. It's right there in the center of the flag today. The chakra. It represents the self-reliance Gandhi preached. But the economic victory came at a cost. The obsession with hand-spun cloth and suspicion of industrialization meant independent India was slow to modernize its textile industry. For decades after independence, the government protected small handloom weavers and restricted big factories. They wanted to preserve the Gandhian ideal. This saved millions of village jobs. But it also meant India lost the global textile race to countries like China and Bangladesh in the late 20th century. It's a complex legacy. Gandhi won the war against Manchester, but the peace was harder to manage. Back in Manchester, the decline that began with the boycott turned terminal. The mills never came back. After the war, British textiles faced new competition from cheap imports and lost its captive markets. Factories closed one by one. Machinery was sold for scrap or shipped overseas. Great chimneys were demolished. Communities built around mills fell into decay. There was bitterness for a long time. The older generation remembered when Manchester clothed the world, and they blamed the loss of empire for their poverty. But over time, as history got re-evaluated, a new understanding emerged. People in Manchester began to see their prosperity had been built on a shaky, unfair foundation. They realized the suffering of the mill worker and the suffering of the Indian weaver were connected. They were both cogs in a machine that only cared about profit. Today, there's a statue of Gandhi in Manchester. It was unveiled in 2019 outside Manchester Cathedral. It's a bronze statue of the little man in the loincloth, smiling. It stands just miles from the sites of factories he helped close. When the statue was proposed, there was controversy. Some asked why we should honor the man who bankrupted our city. But most people accepted it. They accepted it because history has moved on. The statue represents reconciliation. It acknowledges the old world of imperial exploitation had to end. It acknowledges the dignity of people is worth more than a corporation's balance sheet. The story of the Cloth War is a lesson for our world. We live in an age of global supply chains. We wear clothes made in countries we've never visited by people we'll never meet. We often feel powerless to change world injustices. We think corporations are too big and governments too strong. But Gandhi teaches us that power is fragile. Every system depends on the consent of participants. If you withdraw consent, if you refuse to buy, if you refuse to cooperate, the system collapses. He showed the wallet is a weapon. He showed a spinning wheel can be more powerful than a battleship. When we look back at the British Empire, we think of maps colored pink. We think of viceroys in pith helmets, tigers, and elephants. We get lost in romance and pageantry. But we must never forget the cold reality underneath. It was a business. It was about cotton. It was about salt. It was about money. And it was defeated not on the battlefield, but in the marketplace. It was defeated by a man who understood that to break an empire, you don't shoot its soldiers. You bankrupt its shareholders. The victory of Khadi wasn't just an Indian victory. It was a victory for economic self-determination. It inspired movements worldwide. In America, the civil rights movement used economic boycott to fight segregation. Martin Luther King Jr. learned from Gandhi. He realized bus companies in Montgomery, Alabama cared more about profits than racist policies. When black citizens stopped riding buses, companies nearly went broke and laws changed. In South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement used global boycotts of South African goods to pressure the regime. These are echoes of the Cloth War. Gandhi was a complex man. A saint to some, frustrating to others. But his role as an economic strategist is his most underrated legacy. He saw the invisible threads connecting a village in India to the stock exchange in London. He saw that poverty in the East fueled wealth in the West. And he had the guts to cut the fuel line. The silence of Manchester Mills today is the loudest proof of his success. It's the sound of an empire running out of steam. It's the sound of a world changing not by force of arms, but by force of will. So next time you put on a shirt or buy jeans, take a moment. Think about where it came from. Think about the hands that made it. Think about the cotton. And remember the time a simple piece of cloth brought down the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The empire is gone. The mills are closed. But the lesson remains. The economy isn't a force of nature. It's a human creation. And what humans build, humans can dismantle. All it takes is the courage to say no. Gandhi proved that an old man with a spinning wheel could outsmart generals with guns. He proved that a population armed with nothing but conviction could bankrupt an empire armed with everything. He showed us that the real power doesn't come from those who rule, but from those who refuse to be ruled. The British thought India would make them rich forever. Instead, India made them go broke. And that's how you defeat an empire. Not by matching their strength, but by removing their profit.